Good morning, everyone. My name is Melissa Hale, and I'm the manager of the Disability Advocacy Resource Unit. Before we kick off today's session, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and pay my respect to their elders, past and present. I would also like to pay my respect to all other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here on the call today. Welcome to this Advance Your Advocacy Practice session. It's wonderful to see you all here with us today. We encourage your active engagement in this session, so please make sure that your questions are put in the Q&A box, and we'll facilitate a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. First Nations people with disabilities encounter significant barriers in accessing services, and there is insufficient localised individual advocacy services that specifically addresses the unique needs of this group. Today we have Damian Griffis, the CEO of First Peoples Disability Network, who will talk about the challenges and barriers that First Nations people with disability face in accessing services and what advocates can do to help overcome these barriers and meet the needs of First Nations people with disabilities across all service settings. So please extend a warm welcome to Damian Griffiths.
Thanks, Melissa, for that introduction. Good morning, everyone. It's really great to be with you all. Online's always a little bit tricky, not quite personal enough, but it's what we have in this day and age, and I think we're all getting more used to that. But I'd also like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners on the land in which I'm joining you from. I'm joining you today from Ngunnawal Ngambri country in Canberra. At the First Peoples Disability Network, we also like to acknowledge two of our founding elders, Uncle Lester Bostock and Auntie Gail Rankin. Uncle Lester Bostock was a proud Bundjalung man with physical disability who was one of the pioneers of the social movement of First Nations people with disability. And Uncle Lester was also a pioneer of Aboriginal media as well. And Auntie Gail Rankin was a proud Nunanjeri Kaurna woman also with physical disability, who was our chairperson for many years. Sadly, we lost both of our elders several years ago now, but we always like to acknowledge them and thank them for their wisdom in getting us to where we are today. I wanted to sort of have today's presentation as a bit of a call to action. As Melissa has already outlined, the needs of First Nations people with disability are vast and often go unmet, and we have an urgent need for our people with disability to access individual advocacy supports wherever they live. But what I thought I might do is just take you through some of the facts as they relate to disability in our communities, and also just share with you some of the realities of the lives of many of our people with disability. I'm very aware that all of you would be quite familiar with the barriers that Australians with disability face. And sometimes for First Nations people with disability, the disadvantage is often described as a double disadvantage. So I'll take you through that now. And I think we've got opportunity for some questions at the end. So very much looking forward to getting your questions. I think a lot of this early part of the session will be me talking at you. I prefer to have a Q&A, which I'm very much looking forward to that part of the session. So we'll kick off. So the First Peoples Disability Network, for those of you who are not familiar with us, we're a national peak organisation representing First Nations people with disability or Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people with disability. We can trace our gatherings to trace our origins to a gathering of First Nations people with disability that was held in Alice Springs back in 1999. At that gathering, every jurisdiction sent a male and female First Nations person with disability, and one of the recommendations of that gathering was for people to go back to their states and set up state-based networks to be a voice for mob with disability. So in the year 2000, we held a gathering of Aboriginal people with disability at Dharawal Aboriginal Land Council, And from that, we established the Aboriginal Disability Network New South Wales. So myself and Uncle Lester Bostock did that. And then in other jurisdictions, there were sort of loose networks of First Nations people with disability that were established, but none of them were resourced in any meaningful way. There was a network of Aboriginal people with disability in Victoria for a time. Western Australia had a network of health professionals, really. So that wasn't the same thing. We were very keen for this to be a voice of and for First Nations people with disability. And in Queensland, there was the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Disability Network of Queensland as well. But none of them were funded, and our New South Wales network wasn't funded for a number of years either. Fortunately, I was employed by People with Disability Australia around this time, and they generously helped. Part of my role there was to grow the network, to grow the Aboriginal Disability Network of New South Wales. And we're very grateful for People with Disability Australia's support in those early days. It wasn't until 2004 that we received a grant from the Westpac Foundation, actually, to travel around New South Wales and meet directly with mob with disability. So we did that, visited more than 30 communities around New South Wales and wrote a report called Telling It Like It Is. And you can still access that on our website. It was the first report based on direct consultation with First Nations people with disability. So we weren't interested in talking to the service system per se. We wanted to talk to mob with disability themselves. And as you can imagine, that raised any number of issues that related to every aspect of the life of a First Nations person with disability and their family. So very serious discrimination in access to health services, virtually no one we met in meaningful employment, very poor experiences in education, discrimination in intersectional discrimination on the basis of race and disability, major concerns in terms of the overrepresentation of our people with disability in prisons and interactions with police, any number of issues, homelessness, lack of mental health supports. And meanwhile, in other jurisdictions, we were helping out. So the New South Wales network was helping out other states to get their networks going, or at least try and meet in some way. The most active was the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Disability Network of Queensland, that was supported by Queenslanders with disabilities back in those days. So we're talking about 20 years ago now. In South Australia, there was an advisory committee made up of First Nations people with disability that provided advice to the South Australian government. And that was led by Annie Gale Rankin, who I mentioned before. But none of the other states had any resourcing or any funds provided to them. That's not a criticism of them at all. They did their best without any real resourcing. So it wasn't until 2007, when the Rudd government was elected, that myself and Uncle Lester went to see the then Parliamentary Secretary for Disability, Bill Shorten, and talked with him about the need to get a national body going. So this New South Wales network was provided with a small grant, $60,000, to grow the national body. And we did that by holding a couple of meetings in Redfern, where we brought together leaders, First Nations leaders with disability who had met in our travels. And from that, the First Peoples Disability Network was established, the national peak. And that's how we come to be a national organisation. So essentially, the New South Wales network evolved into the First Peoples Disability Network Australia. Some of the things that we were involved in the early days, we were very concerned around the establishment of the NDIS, and still are very concerned about the NDIS, as I'm sure many of you on this call deal with many frustrations with the scheme and representing Australians with disability in in their battles with the scheme, I would say. But one of the things that we did back in 2013, we developed a 10-point plan for the successful implementation of the NDIS in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. And that was actually launched at Parliament House when Jenny Macklin was the minister. I sadly report to you today that really there has been no meaningful change in relation to fair and equitable access to the NDIS for our people. We anticipated this, to be honest, and that's why we wrote a 10-point plan. Usually what happens in major social reforms is First Nations people with disability are left behind. And sadly, the same thing has happened up till now. We are aware of isolated cases where First Nations people with disability are getting good access to the scheme and getting good outcomes. That's a great thing. That's positive. But in our view, you don't really get a badge for that, the NDIS. That's how it should be working. But the reality is it's still missing most of our people with disability, or they're in fact, considered participants in the scheme when they actually aren't getting any meaningful outcomes. So we've done a lot of work. How FPDN works is we do. So we started very small, just with myself and Uncle Lester, and then we became 3 staff and 4 staff, and then 5 staff. We now have about 40 staff located around the country, which has been a long journey to get us to this point. But we have a team that works in what we call education and training, where that team visits communities to educate and inform our people with disability about their rights and entitlements. And they also do something we call disability business training, where they try to get particularly Aboriginal health services to better understand the needs of our community members. We also have a policy team. As all of us know, working in this space, when you're working in disability, you're talking about the whole of life of people. So every element of their life we have to advocate for. So we have policy focus in the area of health and education and justice. And that team, whilst it's grown, is overwhelmed because we often have to walk in what we say are 3 worlds. We have to walk in the disability rights world, in the First Nations justice world, and then the everyone else world, basically. So our challenge is that we have to be a loud voice in all sectors. So it's quite overwhelming, the demand on our policy team. We also have an access and inclusion team, which is an internally focused team, which is about creating. I'm very proud of the work of the access and inclusion team, actually. I'm sure some of you can probably relate to this. One of the things that we've noticed as we've grown as an organisation is, how do you maintain your culture and your integrity, and how do you ensure that you are truly an accessible and inclusive organisation? So, and the way we've decided to do that at FPDN is make sure that's part of our regular focus as an organisation. So we do internal learning sessions amongst ourselves about understanding each other as colleagues and understanding different types of disability, delivered by those staff themselves so that they can lead those discussions. But that's a really important part of what we do as well. And we also have a new kind of NDAP function, which really came out of the DRC. So we do have 4 advocates currently employed, but we are keen to expand our NDAP reach. We recently got our accreditation, which was great news, but we're hopeful and confident, and that needs to be a key focus for our work going forward. After all, that's the most important work we do, is the work we do in community. We also have a philosophy that if we're sitting behind our desk, we're not doing our job. So we are outreach focused in community. That has to be the way we approach things. It's the only way to do it appropriately for any Australian with disability, we would say, but certainly for our communities. So some facts about disability just to, and these are things you may be already aware of. It's always been believed that the prevalence is twice that than the rest of the Australian population. The 2019 census actually concluded that 45% of Aboriginal people have disability or a long-term health condition. So that takes a moment just to contemplate. That's quite extraordinary. But it's actually considered a conservative figure because we actually don't have a measure on the prevalence of psychosocial disability. So we would often say at FPDN, it'd be very unusual for a First Nations person with disability not to have experienced depression or PTSD or anxiety. I'm a person with a psychosocial disability diagnosis, quite a few labels, a lot of different ones from, social phobia to panic disorder to OCD or whatever it might be. I'm very lucky though, because I can get good support. I've got an income and I can access the medications and supports I need without too much trouble. So I'm fortunate that I'm able to manage that largely. But most of our people don't have that experience, obviously. The other thing to note is there's very little written about disability in our communities. If there is, it's probably written by us at FPDN or Dr. Scott Avery, who some of you would be very familiar with. Dr. Scott did his PhD while he was with us, and we're cousins, and he's gone off to bigger and better things in the tertiary sector, which is a great thing. We need academics focusing on this issue. The other thing, the really important thing to note is that most mob with disability actually don't identify as having a disability. So there's a lot of reasons for that. One of the most significant is that why would you take on a perceived negative label when you already experienced discrimination based on your indigeneity? Often parents are very reluctant to seek a label for their child because they have a very real fear of child removal, and that's increasing in every jurisdiction. That's based on a reality. The other thing that's really important to note, in traditional language, we have no comparable word for disability. So that's a wonderful thing. So we are a come as you are culture. Disability, and all of you online would be very familiar, I'm sure, of the history of disability, but it's a very Western construct, and a lot of it can be traced to the Industrial Revolution, really. But in our culture, in First Nations culture, there's evidence to show that disability has always been part of the human experience. And we know this from a fairly recent archaeological discovery at Lake Mungo, where anthropologists and archaeologists have found there's a number of extraordinary things that are discovered at Lake Mungo, but one of them fairly recently is a single footprint, and they say it's a male person with one leg who appears to be using a stick, and also because there's multiple steps, it appears to be moving at speed is the theory, and the theory goes is participating in a hunt. So one leg with a stick. And that's dated at 25,000 years ago. So obviously modifications and supports were made for our people back then as well. There's a lot of evidence to show that sign languages have been in existence for a very long time. Not uncommon for blind community members to be traditional healers, for example. Quite common, actually. And that shows that inclusion is a natural state of being in our community. So that is why Dr. Scott's book is called Culture is Inclusion, because we are a come as you are culture. Now, this presents a problem in this world because when you consider the NDIS, people have to go and take a label to get it, to get the scheme, get on the scheme. So there's a natural disconnect or problem there. Interestingly, when I talk about this worldview with people in the wider Australian disability community, often the reaction is, well, that's what we want. That's the world we want, where it's come as you are and all those things. So we think we have a lot to offer the country in terms of understanding culture. Culture is inclusion. So just a couple of other things. So most of our people with disability are much more likely to acquire disability from preventable health conditions. Diabetes is an example of that. We have very high rates of amputation, much higher than the rest of the Australian population. And that's because of diabetes, for example. Much more likely to live in poverty, and the links between poverty and disability are very clear. Very likely to have poor educational experience, particularly if you live in regional or remote Australia. I mean, the ability the option to even complete school, or if you live in a town where there's only one or two schools, it's virtually impossible to actually get the accommodations or supports you need to be able to participate in school life. And the notion of double disadvantage is a very real thing. So discrimination based on indigeneity and disability is a very real thing. We see this playing out very poorly now in the justice sector. So we often talk about the increasing criminalisation of disability and the fact that many of our people with disability are ending up in Australian prisons and simply shouldn't be there. We have a very high prevalence of our young people in juvenile detention that have disability, often undiagnosed, and also constant number of the cases we deal with are related to police treatment of our young people, and some really disturbing issues in that area, and one that we really want to expose more and more. The overrepresentation of First Nations people with disability in Australian prisons is a national shame, to be frank, but an issue that's rarely talked about, rarely acknowledged, but an absolute reality. We have the issue of indefinite detention still too, particularly in the Northern Territory and Queensland. Look, I to be honest, I'd argue that happens in New South Wales too. I can certainly aware of a couple of cases that are indefinite detention matters, that's for sure. So I won't take you too much more through some of those things. I mean, some of these aspects are just data, not just data, but probably a really important one is that we've always said at least 60,000 of our people are eligible for the NDIS. That's nowhere near what the NDIS would acknowledge or wants to acknowledge, but that's based on the data. So we're a very significant cohort in terms of the NDIS, but that's not often acknowledged, sadly. Yeah, some of the things that are quite stark there is that, at least 2.5 times more likely to experience high psychological distress, 3 times more likely to experience serious illness, and 5 times more likely to experience mental illness or psychosocial disability. So some really concerning things there. Like I said, in our remote communities, if you don't have access to appropriate housing or clean water or sanitation, then they can all cause disability. We do have, and I still don't think most Australians know this, but we still have significant numbers of our people in remote communities who don't have access to clean water. I mean, that's the truth. And a lot of Australians perhaps don't know that. And if they did, I would like to think they'd be really disturbed by that. Where there are issues around violence and abuse, and I don't want to create a view that it's more or worse or more prevalent in First Nations community, because that's not true. But where it is an issue, clearly being exposed to violence and abuse can cause disability. The other thing that is an issue, in those communities where it is an issue, and I always like to remind people, there are no more alcoholics per capita in our community than there are in the rest of the Australian population, but there is that narrative that's been around for a very long time that Aboriginal people are all drunk, sort of thing. That's not true. As a teetotaler myself, and I know plenty of non-drinkers in my life, but not to judge that in any way. But where there are issues of alcohol abuse or substance dependence, that can clearly cause disability as well. But one of the issues that's really not well understood is the psychosocial impact of colonisation, the dispossession from land. What does that do to you? And I'm reminded of I remember a number of years ago now, I was down by the river talking with some elders, and they were deeply distressed because the river had dried up, and that was the place of learning and of culture and fun as well. And it wasn't there anymore effectively, and that hurt them deeply on a level that is hard to explain. The best way I can draw is and we all hear about transgenerational trauma. It's a very familiar term, but it's very real in our communities. And the couple of examples I can give, from time to time, you hear stories of farmers who have to leave their farm because it's no longer profitable for them, and they may have been farming that land for 3 or 4 or 5 generations, and they talk about leaving the land with great pain, and it's very real pain. I don't understand why the connection is not made to the First Nations experience in that context. Or there's been a lot of research done on transgenerational trauma in Jewish communities as well, post-Holocaust traumas, and there's other communities as well where there's ongoing trauma, as we see play out in other parts of the world at the moment. What happens with that is people can so in the research done on Holocaust survivors, they talk about grandchildren exhibiting behaviours that relate to, say, that are trauma behaviours, but they weren't in the actual Holocaust places, and we'll see that play out now in the conflicts around the world as well. But why those connections aren't always understood or made for First Nations people is an ongoing frustration in many ways. So we have issues of undiagnosed disability as well. I don't want to. It doesn't sound very nice, this presentation. So I'm really keen to talk with you all about what can we do about it. And we're often talking about the denial of the most fundamental of human rights. So access to shelter, access to education, an obvious thing to say, but First Nations people have different experiences depending on where they live. Generally speaking, I'm generalizing and maybe romanticizing a bit, but in Western Sydney, which is the largest Aboriginal population in Australia, there's generally more options in terms of Aboriginal owned and operated services. That's not to say our community members aren't living in poverty out there, but it obviously, as you get into regional remote parts of the country, services dissipate dramatically. And we're often talking about a failure here of government and non-government service providers. And we also have to say a failure sometimes of our own Aboriginal First Nations services as well to meet the needs of community members with disability. We have a very dominant, very medical model dominant world, which is a perverse problem. Whilst I talked about culture as inclusion and the come as you are understanding of disability, we've also inherited some of the worst aspects of medical model as well. So we have a very dominant Aboriginal health sector, which is not wrong. I'm not saying that's wrong, but it's come at the expense of understanding disability in many ways. And there's just a general lack of awareness. And a lot of you that do advocacy know this only too well, but poor access to information is a fundamental barrier for every Australian with disability, and plays out very badly in a First Nations context. Not even being aware of, I mean, the awareness of things like the NDIS in regional remote Australia is non-existent, or it's even a concept that a lot of mob would say, well, that's not for me, that's a white fella thing, or because even the language is problematic. Notions of insurance, disability as well, are quite problematic. So yes, we developed a 10-point plan to meet the needs of our people with disability. I can take you through some of those things at another time, but I'm really keen, Melissa, to have as many questions as we possibly can. I mean, I can keep talking, but I'm really keen to make this as proactive as we can, if that's okay with you. One of the things I was really keen to talk about is how we can grow the understanding or the availability of individual advocacy for mob. A lot of our people wouldn't know it's there. I am very aware of some organisations have done some great work engaging with our communities, and I really want to acknowledge that. And we need to keep doing it because the needs are so great. But I'm sort of, I get to this point. I've done a lot of talking. I'll be really keen to do some back and forth, if that's all right.
Not a problem, Damien. Thank you very much for that presentation. It was really, really useful. I cannot believe how much of the population has a disability, and that's something I've learned today, that the lack of support is so great for such a huge population of people. It's something none of us can afford to ignore. We all need to get better at doing better. So I think one of the first first I would like everyone to start putting your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll get through as many as we can. But I'm just thinking, to kick us off, foundational support is the buzzword at the moment. So we're talking about, how we reach people, how we make sure that between mainstream services and the NDIS, that there's no gap in between. I'm really interested to hear from your perspective what is needed for First Nations Aboriginal people with disability.
That's a great question, Melissa, and thanks for raising it, because we have a number of concerns, as I'm sure everyone does, around the design of foundational supports. It feels really rushed from our perspective. I don't know how other people are feeling, but it certainly feels very rushed. The most critical thing is understanding is we need to get an understanding of the degree of poverty. What I mean by that is material poverty. We don't have cultural poverty, but we have material poverty. So understanding that many of our people with disability live day to day and live meal to meal virtually. And unless we start addressing those foundations, that's a foundation. The right to an adequate diet is a fundamental human right. Unless we understand those as foundations, then I fear that we'll design something that again is out of reach. So It's a bit
Mhm.
like with the NDIS. It's sometimes, and I don't know how other people feel about this, but having discussions with some of our people about goals and stuff like that is truly bizarre when you're actually trying to live day to day. I'm not saying people shouldn't have aspiration. That's not what I'm saying. But unless we recognize that many of our people live in abject poverty, and that is the first thing to address, then we're only ever going to be sort of picking at the edges, I think.
Mhm.
And it also needs to have a strong cultural component. So access to culture, access to country has to be a foundational element of foundational support
Yeah.
going forward. But
And
yeah, share some concerns there. I don't know how I'll be very interested to know how other people are feeling about it, because it's something that has to be got so right. I think it's really important that we get across it.
yeah, 100%. And that is definitely a theme that we've been hearing as well. People can't really address disability needs if they still don't have housing, they don't have they're escaping family violence, or they don't have that living day to day, like you said. So how can someone focus on what our goals and aspirations are if we don't actually have the fundamental thing to live a well life? So it's definitely a common theme coming through. Now we've got lots of questions coming through, and I'm really excited to start reading through some of them. So the first question that comes through is, what is the first thing we can do to understand and support Engage better from an advocate's perspective?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm a real advocate, if you like, of a concerted outreach approach. You've got to go to people. And I know how hard this is for all of us because we're all under-resourced. Uh, and even being able to travel into your regions or outside and meet with people is a budget constraint. And I think as a collective, we need to advocate the need for NDAP or individual advocacy funding to recognise that concerted outreach approach is the best way to go.
Mm,
That's not unique to mob with disability, of course. Um, so getting out into community and doing it in partnership with FPDN, we'd be always happy to partner, and we need other providers to be able to fill the gap. We're not naive enough to think that FPDN can do it all. So um, the other thing is you've always got to go with humility. And I know this, I know you all know this, and you would do that in your practice anyway as advocates. But it's really important to tread softly and tread quietly. And it's not uncommon as well in our communities to um, there can be a lot of anger and frustration. So having the kind of, how would I say it, the sort of emotional intelligence to go, well, it's not about me. That's about uh, the circumstance. Um, but also having said that, some of the relationships that anyone can build with our communities can be some of the tightest you'll ever have in your life as well. Um, you can be confident of that. So concerted outreach approach, going to community, doing it in partnership with Aboriginal organisations,
yeah.
recognising it may take time and may take multiple visits is what I'd recommend. I know how hard that is to do though with everyone's budgets, but
We can't afford not to do it well. So relationships, time, trust building, and all that sort of thing is really, really important. And the outreach approach, a big fan. So the next question we've got is, I work at a community legal centre in the disability law space, including disability discrimination assistance. Do you have any tips on how we broach the topic of asking about disability access needs for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in a way that's respectful and mindful of the potential concerns about disclosure? Interesting one.
that is a great question and
Mm,
gets to the point of some of the challenges. So first thing is it's a bit similar to what we just said. It's got to be concerted outreach. It's got to be approaching community with humility. I would recommend doing it in partnership with an Aboriginal organisation, even for the first few visits to build rapport and uh, get that credibility going. Um, talking about discrimination is hard to do, and it's hard to do anywhere, anytime, not just with mob with disability, of course. And to talk about disability discrimination, I used to work at the Human Rights Commission a very, very long time ago, 26 years ago or something. And when I was there, I don't ever remember a First Nations person ever making a complaint about disability discrimination. And I doubt that that's changed, to be honest. And that would be because, firstly, it'd be, well, that's a white fella system that, it's not really for me. Am I being discriminated against based on disability, or is it race, or is it both? That's often the issue. It usually is both. And I think one of the other challenges, so the language is problematic. The other way to approach sensitive issues and is to do it. I hope I'm making sense when I say this, but in a quiet voice. So, so some of our communities are some of the most consulted communities on the planet. Don't worry about that. And everyone has seen, and most weeks Aboriginal communities would have visits from bureaucrats or whatever, and are very familiar with, saying what they need to say. You've got to meet people where they are on their terms. So sometimes that might be down by the river, but doing it in partnership with an organisation like FPDN will be your best way forward. We need more of our people accessing disability discrimination law. And I think the other way we've often thought about it is more group complaints as well. So it doesn't go on to the individual as something that they just have to carry. Plenty of our communities could make significant disability group complaints, believe me, around a whole range of issues. So I think that's the other method that's worth considering as well.
Yeah, that's really great advice. Okay, next one. What is the best way to make sure we can better meet the needs of people from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community who have a disability and are experiencing family violence?
Yeah, that's another great question. We do deal with a number of matters in our individual advocacy that are related to that. Obviously, the context is really important. We have some communities which are really struggle, right? But I don't want to give the perception that it's universal, because there's plenty of communities that function very well. And they're often very small, isolated communities with not a lot of people. And relations are very intense, and people all know each other very well. And going in there and is a challenge, can be a challenge. So again, it's relational. We do have an issue, most definitely, as the Royal Commission exposed, of the vulnerability of our women with disability, as it is for every woman with disability in Australia. And that vulnerability is very real. The challenges in our communities are often how do you escape violence when you are in regional remote Australia as well. What's your means to leave is really problematic. Again, that's about engaging with respected members in the community who are aware of the issue and are willing to lead on it, to be honest. That's the way change will happen in our communities, is through leadership in the community itself. And that does happen. It absolutely happens, and things can turn around. But that's what's got to be led by the community itself. So the role that we can play is giving the framework for, say, legal help or is one thing, but being there to potentially be another source of support is definitely an option for advocates. I think if any of you have dealt with some of the advocacy matters that, it's certainly the same for us. They're often very, very complex in our communities, very complex. And they're often extremely urgent, and they can relate to things that are, I've been involved in a couple of matters the last couple of weeks that are life and death, actually. No two ways about it. And and violence is an element. But there's also a context which is of poverty, and there can be other elements of play, substance abuse and things like that. So, and the degree of abuse that some of our women experience is shameful and extreme. So there are conversations going on more and more. There is a national plan, as we know, to end violence, and there is a very strong First Nations element to that, led by First Nations people. But the first thing always is people need to be safe. The other challenge as well is police in in regional remote communities, and I do have some sympathy for police in regional remote communities in the sense that they are often the only service. So police are often called to intervene in our remote communities, and community themselves will use police to do that, because there is no mental health team, there is no family violence support, there is nothing else but the local cop shop.
Mm.
So we have this really perverse kind of problem. Again, a lack of resources, a lack of focus. Elders are the answer. Elders have the way, and we need to support them to make the change that they want to make in their communities.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Damien. Um, what do you mean by quiet voice? Do you mean with interest and reflective listening, empathy, and sensitivity?
Absolutely. You just answered it for yourself. That's exactly what it is. So quiet voice, yeah. So how do I describe it? I mean, yeah, you just don't go in there loud with all the answers, you know. You
Yeah.
just sort of go, and you've used the words beautifully, reflective, listening. You know, you learn more from listening than talking, eh? So yeah, you just don't. I've seen some amazing things in my time of even well-meaning people who rock up and want to save the world, you know. I mean, sure, but it doesn't work like that. You know, it's got to be the real knowledge sits within the community. We're just facilitators. You know, it's the same at FPDN. And elders are always right. So we're an elder-based culture, different to, and there's many elder-based cultures, of course. And elders have earned their place, so they have the respect of our people. They may not use the perfect words or describe the things in the perfect way, but they are the authority. And Western culture, of course, is sort of job title, eh? So when you get a title, you have that authority. Our culture's an earned authority, you know, which I think is a good thing, to be honest. Not unique to certainly my partner's Chinese culture is the same. You know, there's plenty of elder cultures around, plenty of Islamic Muslim communities are the same. So, and in the Pacific, it's very similar as well. So, so that's where you know we're not we're not the expert. We're there to listen and learn. But you said those words beautifully. Whoever asked that, so thank you.
I can imagine an elder, but I love that distinction, an elder-based culture rather than someone's job title. Because I imagine it must be frustrating to have someone with a fancy job title come and tell you how things are. So that is a really, really good way of describing things.
Yeah.
Our next question is, how can we engage both people in our metropolitan council consultations when developing disability action plans? We have engaged with both People's Disability Network, who have kindly shared their 10-point plan. Other than using the 10-point plan, what more can we do?
Yeah, so I mean, if I understand that right, you're talking about sort of at a local level. So
Yeah.
yeah, a lot of councils around, well, some depending on their politics, I suppose. But some councils do have Aboriginal or First Nations advisory bodies, and they'd be your first port of call. City of Sydney is very active in that way, is a good example, and elders play a significant role in the way that council works, for example, and that's not unusual in other councils around the country. But again, it's very political, though. It would depend. There's also other councils who don't want to do welcome to countries anymore and all sorts of stuff. So there's there's a broad spectrum there. Every community around Australia in metropolitan areas would have, you know, Western Sydney, like I said before, largest Aboriginal population in Australia, has a number of very well-known elders, and it's not hard to tap into if you just ask around a little bit. Building relations with your Aboriginal organisations in your area is also really important. You might not always get a warm reception. That's the other thing about talking quietly. You've got to understand that that's built on bad history, you know? It's not a personal thing. So the other thing that's really important, I have to do the same myself, is don't personalize, eh? So if you don't get the warmest reception sometimes, don't take it personally. That's based on good reason, you know? Probably been offered many things many times and nothing's delivered. So you got to stick with it, you know, and take a few hits along the way as well. Some elders might set you really straight as well. So being humble enough to accept that and recognize that, I'm going to keep coming back though. I'm a genuine ally. I want to be an ally. I'm not here to take over, of course. I'm here to be an ally. I've got some knowledge I want to share with you. And I've got a lot to learn from you. So two-way learning too is really important.
That's really, really great advice. I think we've got time for two more questions. They're coming in thick and fast. So what would be the best way to introduce the concept of advocacy to local community members? It's a term frequently not known or understood.
It's a great question. Yeah, no, I wouldn't use the term, funny enough, just to confuse things altogether. Usually don't talk about disability and usually don't talk about advocacy, actually. The way I would go out into community and say, hey, want to have a yarn about helping out some mob that might be struggling, or advocacy is a term that's not used often, or we just want to stand beside you, or we've got some knowledge we want to share with you and we want to be an ally or be a friend, or and we want to learn from you. But disability is even problematic. So sometimes you might put out a flyer, say, let's come and have a yarn about disability, and no one will show up because there can be all sorts of factors. And we would all know this already. Doesn't just relate to mob. There's shame factors and all sorts of things. So we're here to help. We want to have a yarn with you about what we can do. This is who we are. And we want to see if we can help and offer something to your community. Disability is becoming more and more common understanding of what it is. 20 years ago, I would have said community would have just thought someone who uses a wheelchair and wouldn't have thought about disability in its broadest context. But advocacy is not a term that's well understood.
Yeah, thanks. And the last question, do you have any suggestions or suggested resources that can assist understanding of providing culturally safe services and communication?
Yeah, great. Culture is Inclusion. Dr. Scott Avery's book, Culture is Inclusion. Read that. You can still order it off our website, I think. So that's a brilliant resource. So, and we've got some information material at FPDN that can help you. So I'd encourage you just to drop me an email and I'll put you in touch with our comms people and we can send out brochures and stuff. We've got a lot of things we'd love to send to anyone who's on the session today. And if you want to email me, we can send you through stuff, and always really happy to talk in partnership with any of you. It wouldn't necessarily be me, but I've got team members who can help out across a range of things. We're really anxious to build relationships, so please do reach out, and I'll put you in touch with relevant people at FPDN. So thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you, Damien. So that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to reach out and get a list of some of these resources and ways of contacting FP, First Nation Disability Network, and the link to Culture is Inclusion resource as well. And then we will put it all on the DAWI website so people can access this later on. But I just want to thank you so much for sharing. I think I personally have learned so much today about things I thought I knew, but actually, no, I don't know, and what it actually means to work alongside people, First Nations people with disability as an ally and a genuine ally, and taking the lead from people with lived experience. So thank you very much for being here. Thank you everyone else for attending today and for your amazing questions. You're really, really thought-provoking. And thank you to the Auslan interpreters. I hope you all have a great day. Thank you and see you next time.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Melissa. Thank you. See you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.